welcome to No Power Zone. So this is the second portion of our new series, Super Nerds, and today I have the featured Super Nerd of this month, Christopher Stoll. So tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, what your background is.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name's Chris. My background is in biology and with a little bit of veterinary anatomy thrown in. I actually have no background specifically in fine arts or illustration. All of that is self-taught. And when it comes to the work that I do, I try and draw from my background in science principally, and then focus that through an artistic lens. And my most recent book is Pokenatomy, which is what I think we're mostly talking about today. And it's a 300-page scientific guide to the biology, behavior, abilities of Pokemon, sort of presented through a modern veterinary lens, if that makes sense.
Yes, no, that's what I was going to actually transition to next. The big focus of what I'm talking to you today is Pokenatomy. For those of you watching the video portion, he was holding up the hardcover, and I have the leather-bound edition here, all emblazoned in gold, and it's really nice. I love this. So it's a really nice book. I'm actually going to, for those of you in the video portion, open it up and show you a little bit of the pages. So you see, hang on, there we go. There's the biological functions of a lot of the cool Pokemon from the original 151. There's descriptions, and it's incredibly detailed, and I love it. So as a Pokemon fan, it's really one of my favorite books ever. So it's awesome.
That's so sweet.
The big idea of it, though, is that it's a deconstruction. So if Pokenatomy is a deconstruction of Pokemon, would you mind starting off with telling us what is a deconstruction?
Oh boy, starting with the big questions. So when I think about a deconstruction, I think of it as a way of breaking something that feels holistic and complete down into its constituent parts and examining them sincerely and trying to sort of play out the implications and see where those take you. And I really feel like nowadays we're kind of in the golden age of deconstruction and deconstructing media, online articles questioning the implications and the ideas behind Disney films or, Pokemon, video game logic, that sort of thing. There are a lot of really enterprising YouTubers who make a whole career out of breaking down things, deconstructing them. And even in media itself, I feel like recently, Cabin in the Woods or the Lego Movie or even Mad Max Fury Road, these are sort of deconstructive narratives where they take a premise that is familiar and engaging, and then they start asking more and more questions and really start delving into its core. And so when it comes to my deconstructive work, that's how I like to think about it is, following through to the most extreme implications and conclusions.
Okay, yeah, and that's kind of a good segue into my next question. Why do you personally deconstruct things? What do you like about it?
Oh boy. Well, like I said, my background is principally in biology and science, and I like thinking about these sort of absurd premises like Pokemon, which on the face of it, there's a lot of impossible stuff going on, and it's something that, I'm sure a lot of your audience loves, that a lot of people our age loved growing up, taking that sort of thing, which when you were a kid was, simplistic and surface level, and thinking about the underpinnings of that world fascinates me from sort of a creative, the point of a creative challenge, working backwards to imagine, is any of this possible? To what degree does this premise play out?
Is a walking plant like Bellsprout supposed to be just accepted on a child? That is a talking, walking plant, Bellsprout. Or is there a scientific function or reason of why Bellsprout's able to have its legs and its mouth and whatnot, right?
Oh, yeah. And it appeals to me. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, well, no, keep going.
No. It appeals to me, too, just because I feel like that's the way a lot of people, myself included, sort of move through the world. We engage with systems and people sort of on the surface level, and we don't often think about the complex underpinnings that, fit into everything that we interact with. And so I get a real, kind of artistic thrill from examining things that at first seem simple, but have some real depth to them. So that's the interest for me.
Okay, very cool. So then, what is your background in Pokemon? How are you familiar with the series?
Oh boy, I was at ground zero when Pokemon came to the States back in the 90s. I think it was like 8 or 9 years old when it really got big. And
Mm-hmm.
so every recess, I had the cards. I played yellow, blue, and red, all to completion. First generation was something I lived and breathed back when I was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
After that, played through gold and silver, kept, a pretty healthy interest in the mythology and the games and the a lot of the fan art, just as like in that period in the early 2000s when fan communities were really sort of burgeoning online. I
Mm-hmm.
was involved in a lot of that and really enjoyed it, and then sort of lost track of it when I like made it past high school and into college, and then recently started really considering it again through this new lens, specifically with regard to Pokenatomy.
All
So,
right.
like I think the last one I played, well, I played Sun, and
Mm-hmm.
really enjoyed that. My brother got me a copy for Christmas like 2 years ago.
All right. So this we'll sort of tie all these recent questions in together. So why did you decide to deconstruct Pokemon? What's the purpose of and why you selected Pokemon? Go a bit more into that, maybe.
Oh boy. Well, like I said, I was always a big Pokemon fan, so I had more
Mm-hmm.
than a passing familiarity with, the
Mm-hmm.
mythology, the canon, the way that
Yeah.
Pokemon are supposed to sort of live and breathe and inhabit the world.
Mm-hmm.
And my interest in biology and vertebrate anatomy tied in really naturally with that,
Mm-hmm.
because if I wanted to choose, I wanted to choose a subject for this weird desire to deconstruct. And it could have been aliens, it could have been Star Trek or Star Wars, it could have
Mm-hmm.
been, um, you know, figures in literature or Lord of the Rings. But Pokemon presented such a wide variety of life forms with
Mm-hmm.
such an intriguing variety of abilities and skills and limits. And some of them were, really, really out there. You look at something like
Mm-hmm.
Alakazam and like, what sort of creature could that possibly parallel with in our real world? What preposterous abilities? How does that function? And then you have something like Staryu
Mm-hmm.
or Magikarp, which are much more, or like Pidgey,
Mm-hmm.
which are much more closely tied to actual organisms.
Mm-hmm.
And so that provided a wide variety of things to practice with and to look into, and sort of a gradient from like plausible way over here with Pidgey all the way to these insane abilities and incredible conceptions of life.
Yeah. One of my favorites in terms of the how does that work was Gengar and the Ghastly Starter evolution line. In the book, they are made out to be bacteria, right? And they are bacteria specifically from a living organism that had died. So that way you get this sort of ability that they are like able to phase through things that are more gaseous, and you
Mhm.
also keep that sort of death and ghost ambience with them as well. And I thought that was brilliant how you just sort of put a real world explanation to the creation of Ghastly, Haunter, and Gengar. So that's my kudos to you right there.
Thank you.
And moving on though, so what were the this is actually perfect segue actually. What were the challenges of trying to put real world science and explanations into topics such as Pokemon?
Well, like I was working backwards from some really incredible premises, and I wanted to like capture these two really difficult and kind of contradictory ideas. I wanted it
Mm-hmm.
to be um, scientifically plausible wherever
Mm-hmm.
possible. I wanted to make this something that tied in with real biology and was not just, preposterous
Mm-hmm.
notions thrown on the page. And I also wanted to keep it as consistent as possible with
Yeah.
Pokemon lore and the canon thus far. And so, with something like uh, Ghastly, like you just mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
I wanted, like, even the really outlandish Pokemon, I wanted to tie in with like actual biological, physiological phenomenons in the real
Mm-hmm.
world, the way organ systems or organisms work. And in that case, if it's a colonial intelligence comprised of bacteria, you can talk about how something without a central nervous system in the real world can still navigate around obstacles, can still find food, can function, can reproduce. And you don't lose that association in the like in the canon of
Mm-hmm.
Pokemon with the dead and the dying. They can be these necrotic bacteria, and you
Mm-hmm.
you try and bridge that gap wherever you can with something like Grimer, based it on the anatomy of slime molds. They're these like protoplasmic sheaths with all these free floating
Mm-hmm.
nuclei inside. And I was looking for something like it's got to be a detritivore. It's got to eat like dead, decaying matter. It's got to be toxic and kind of amorphous. And I was able to find something in the real world that tied in with that and still didn't contradict, the Pokemon canon. Does that make sense?
Yeah, staying true to the characters, but also not just ignoring the fact that, mice aren't electric. There has to be a reason inside this mouse that allows him to use Thunderbolt attack. Like, maybe looking at eels. Actually, I haven't looked at Pikachu in the book yet. But maybe using, like, eels. How did she even describe it? Let's take a look, maybe.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, Pikachu's, what, number 25, I think?
It is. You're right on the money with the eel thing.
Okay, yeah.
Based, at least in part, on the anatomy of electric eels. They have these organs called electrocytes, which shunt sodium ions along the length of their body to create this electrical potential, and they can release it all at once in the form of a discharge. And so, like, transplanting that organ system from a real existing creature sort of into the body of a mammal is a way of exploring this incredible biological phenomenon, actually, like, using Pokemon as a lens to appreciate like real science and the beauty of biology, and alternatively, biology is a way of exploring and delving into Pokemon. There it is.
Yep. And I'm not sure I'm going to be able to point to it, but there's I hope I'm pointing to it, the secondary electrocyte, is that what you called it, right?
Electrocyte.
Yes. And so, yeah, that's very cool. And so, yeah, staying true to the characters, but also having actual logical explanations. Yes. So moving on, this is actually just more of my own personal interest. Were you the kid who got a huge kick out of dissecting the frogs in school?
Oh boy, not really. I went to public school for most of my life, and we didn't get frogs. I think I dissected a worm, and that was no fun because it's just
a worm.
Yeah, it's just a worm. It's just like it's mostly dirt in there. It's so small, clumsy little kid hands. And then later on, at some point, we dissected cow eyes, and I thought that was gross because they had a tendency to spray. And even my iron stomach has limits.
Yeah.
But like I don't know, I was always fascinated in the abstract with biology and the way that bodies function. Okay. But I never got elbow deep.
Yeah, that makes sense. So moving on, what was your favorite Pokemon to deconstruct, and what's your favorite work in general that you've just done overall?
Oh boy, all right. I really enjoyed some of the more like peculiar ones, especially ones based on like prehistoric life. Paleontology is also like kind of a side interest of mine, and so I liked being able to base, for example, Gyarados on the sort of hypothetical deep sea predators that, or not hypothetical, but like the hypothetical biology of deep sea predators that no longer exist. And to delve into that literature, every Pokemon that I put together required, in addition to all the illustration and the writing, like some research, and often that was for me the most invigorating part. And I loved with like Lapras, with Aerodactyl, with Gyarados, being able to look into the past and find creatures that no longer existed, and to sort of think meaningfully about how they might work and how they can tie in with these creatures in the Pokemon world. And that's where it feels like our world and its life and the Pokemon world are closest together when you're looking at things like dinosaurs.
Because dinosaurs are things that no longer exist but did, so you're able to bridge the gap of things that don't exist and things that do exist by things that no longer... Okay, that's very cool. Okay.
It's kind of this like additional level of separation where you can't study them directly, but just like Pokemon, they exist in some ways in like the collective imaginations and collective understandings of people.
So then, favorite work in general, then? Any specific ones? You have some stuff behind you as well?
Oh, this is stuff I pick up
Oh, you pick up at cons? Got it. Okay, never mind. All right, but what's your favorite work you've done, then? You've done some Disney Princesses as Adventures that have been popular as well.
Oh, man, that was a while ago. It's hard to choose a favorite work. Often
that makes sense.
Yeah, often I find that, like, the way that I feel about a work in the moment doesn't necessarily translate over time. So there's some pieces that I was extremely excited to put together, but 6 months later I feel kind of disparaging about, and there are other pieces that I never got that thrill of excitement producing, but that ultimately I can always look back fondly upon. Some of the Pokemon in the book really enjoyed doing them, but because those were part of a collection, none of them are individually like really, really incredible. I think my most recent piece that I've been really happy with was probably this mechanical breakdown of Diva from Overwatch.
Yes, from Overwatch, yes.
So I really enjoyed doing that, and so far that one's the one that like I think most fondly of. But hey, in a couple of weeks I might have totally changed.
Yeah, all right, understandable. And I like you brought that up because we're going to talk about that in a little bit. We got a few more questions down the line for that one, though. But so, what did you hope audiences would sort of think about Pokenatomy? What do you think readers should take away after reading it?
I think the goals were there were multiple goals and motivations working all at once. I wanted it to be something that would reinvigorate people's love of Pokemon, which I felt like I'd lost a little bit growing up and was able to rediscover through this deconstructive lens. When you're in your 20s, it can be harder to engage with it just like totally at face value, at least for me. And so even though I still love the games, I want to be able to like think about it and investigate it deeper. And so I hope that in a certain sense, it encourages people to reconnect with that childhood love of Pokemon that they may have had and has since waned. In another sense, I'd like for it to teach people like a little bit of biology, a little bit of science. I tried to keep that consistent and make it something that people would really enjoy. I get a lot of messages from like biology teachers, like high school science teachers who say they bought the book to try and get their kids interested in body science, body systems by connecting it to something they love. So I hope that, conversely, it will like get people interested in science, that it'll kind of, connect them with that. I always think that's a good thing. And I guess like a final goal is to kind of like unsettle and perturb people. There's something like not in a hostile way, but there's something kind of peculiar about looking at a Pikachu, this cute cartoony thing about which you've never really had to think like, well, does it have a skull or like a brain beneath that or muscles above that? And considering the biomechanics there, I think that it's a fun mental exercise personally to kind of to engage with that, the preposterousness of it, something like Meowth with the huge head and the eyes. There's like a weird, like a Burton-esque peculiarity to like thinking about that even for a moment. And I like seeing kids like come up to my work at a booth at a con or something and being like, oh, it's so gross, oh my god, but I love it. Like that sort of repulsive back and forth. What's just even for a moment making someone hold those two kind of contradictory emotions together.
That's cool. Very nice. But moving on, so this might be a little bit vague, but it's kind of broad, I guess. What do you think about when you're going to deconstruct a character? What sort of do you try and focus on, I guess?
Well, like specifically in terms of like the artistic process, the first thing I do is just draw the creature itself without, I don't layer from the inside out generally. I'll typically draw Pikachu as Pikachu is. And that way the biology doesn't get in the way of the character. I want to sort of work backwards from Nintendo's characters and flesh out the biology behind that or its mechanics. And I don't want my preconceptions of how something should work interfere with like its connection to the character. So usually if I was drawing Pikachu, draw Pikachu first, and then I would like save that layer in my program and sort of cut away sections and begin to think sort of layer deeper and deeper. What's underneath that? How does this function? And in that regard, like usually that's where the research enters in, but it varies from piece to piece. Like on some of the more mechanical pieces I've been doing more recently, there's much, much less research. It's more about attempting to present visually the way that something functions. And then with biology, you have to kind of know how the organs look, because there's nothing about a lung. Like if you didn't know anything about biology and looked into a body, there's nothing about a lung, just looking at it, that indicates its function particularly.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, like if you looked at a lung and a kidney together, you'd be like, I don't necessarily know which one is which. But when it's like go ahead.
So like it all goes back to just having understanding prior, like looking at a long. We just automatically know as like educated people that that's how you breathe. But if you don't have that kind of knowledge to begin with, how do you showcase that, right?
Exactly.
Yes. Okay.
And so, like, with something mechanical, like a piston has sort of an implicit function that you can understand by its structure. Organs don't necessarily have that. You need sort of a baseline familiarity. And so I try and think about the audience, what they might be familiar with, what I need to label. I try and view it from the perspective of someone who's picking up the book for the first time, pulling it open. And I want that, like, the sense of what this illustration is and what this illustration is trying to convey sort of come across instantly. And so,
yeah,
I hope that makes sense.
it makes sense to me, and hopefully our listeners, it makes sense to them too. I think you're very good at your craft of sort of explaining these things that not everyone should be familiar with. I think that's one of my big things of why I like it. And you're not like you're self-trained in the art world. I was in art school for a semester, and I had a lot of friends in the illustration department. The point of illustration is always to convey the message to the reader clearly and concisely, so that an imbecile could figure it out just by looking at it. And I think you do a great job of getting that across. Especially like there were kids like specifically for medical and biological illustrations, and so their task is like, this is a heart, this is all the parts of heart, this is the function, and you should be able to look at it and say, yep, that's a heart, that's what that does. So kudos to you. You really are great at explaining and showcasing.
That's so sweet. I'm blushing. It's another like weird thing with biology specifically is just like clearly differentiating everything. Like if you look at actual biology, or you've ever seen like a dissection, not that I recommend anyone go look up any videos, but everything's sort of indistinct and interwoven. And part of the goal in any medical illustration is to sort of differentiate things and clarify without reducing or like reducing its actual complexity. So just like where I'm trying to strive between scientific accuracy and Pokemon canon, I'm so too trying to describe, like, find a happy place between like concise, clearly conveyed illustrations and accuracy to the actual structures, which are not themselves usually very clear or totally differentiated in the body.
One thing, I'm not an expert, but maybe like an example might be like, where's the small intestine begin and the large intestine end? You know, maybe they're not as well laid out or visibly identifiable.
Or color coded.
Yeah, color. So when you're illustrating this, you have to make sure the audience and readers understand this is the small intestine and this is the large intestine, and they're separate. And I think that's something you do good as well.
Oh, thank you.
But yeah, going back though, so what would you like to tell us about the purpose, content, and creation of the book? I actually want you to take us on the journey of Pokenatomy from the project's beginning, middle, and end, if you can.
Wow. All right. So the project began sort of as a fluke. I had this idea in my mind that I really wanted to do some deconstructive illustrations of popular characters. It was a motif that I'd seen toyed with a little bit. I think I'd seen like a Godzilla, maybe even like a Yoshi or something floating around the internet. And my initial impression was like, I think I could do that better. I think that there's like thematic and like artistic meat here that I could dig into. And so I did an illustration. I did like 5 or 6 illustrations of the first couple Pokemon that interested me. And I think it was the starters, Charmander, Bulbasaur, Squirtle, Pikachu, probably then did like Jigglypuff and Scyther, just some others that I thought were interesting for personal reasons. And sort of tossed them out onto my social media and like the internet generally. And, I illustrate as much as I can all the time. And so I'm always putting stuff out, and typically you get fans that react positively, but in this case, it really like blew up. And suddenly Dorkly was calling, and like Comedy Central's website, and I was getting questions from magazines, online periodicals, and others. And that like enormous reaction surprised me. I felt like there was a real desire at that moment. And I guess this was about 2 years ago, give or take, that I really started for this sort of thing. And but even then, after that popularity, I wasn't necessarily like, okay, I'm going to do the whole book, 151, 152 ultimately, because Togepi's in there, illustrations. That was not part of the plan. But then I started getting really positive reactions, specifically from younger people, and in addition, like those teachers I was telling you about.
Yes.
People, and that convinced me almost single-handedly that this was something I wanted to pursue, that I was willing to dedicate some time to putting it together. And so starting from there, I cloistered myself away for 6 months to get as many Pokemon as I could get done and just tackle that, see if it works. After that, I had about 70 to 100 more or less finished with various stages of writing. And so I went from there, took it to Kickstarter to see if I could keep this ball rolling. Exactly. Actually make it viable. So I started, I had the project half to 2/3 done after an exhausting 6 months, and I tried to present it to people. And there was, again, a really positive, really overwhelming response that convinced me once again, hey, there's a demand for this. People want it. People are really supportive and encouraging. And that ended up getting me through the next 6 to 8 months. The whole project in earnest took about a year and change to get all that done. So it's 300 or so illustrations. And that's the Pokemon and their organs. So a lot of depth and layers, and basically working on it full time with really, really generous, encouraging support from the fan community, from Pokemon people, from Nintendo fans, from lovers of biology and deconstructive literature.
I'm actually surprised it didn't take you over 2 years when you say that. Because it's not as simple as just drawing one of the Pokemon and then just drawing all 152, including Togepi. You're drawing all of the organs, you're drawing you're thinking about how things should work, you're writing descriptions, and it's a whole book too. And so I'm surprised it's actually that quick. So once again, much speaks to your talent. Yeah.
I think it helped just because there was a lot less sketching or conceptual work that I had to do because the Pokemon already existed.
That makes sense.
I knew what a Magikarp looked like, so I was able to draw that, and then and don't get me wrong, it was very time consuming, but I wasn't inventing creatures out of whole cloth. I was delving into how something that already existed functioned, and I think that really helped maintain the momentum of the project and kept me from being burnt out. Because if I had to make up a creature every day for a year, I think I would go totally insane.
That makes sense. And you also can when you can move on to Magikarp's halfway done, but maybe I want to skip to Vileplume because Vileplume is how I'm feeling today or something. So going back to just the purpose, content, and creation though, we want to touch on that.
Just generally.
You wanted to speak with that, I believe, as well previously, correct?
Yeah. Like I said, I think one thing this is exactly the sort of book I really, really would have wanted as a kid. And that was a big motivator once I started getting responses from younger people, from teenagers, and from people with kids who said that the artwork, the initial pieces, had really captured them. And so aside from just the goal of potentially teaching science or igniting a love of science in a lot of younger people, I really enjoyed I'm kind of enamored with the idea of literature that is in world, that feels like it's come straight from another world, even something that's mundane, like a medical textbook. And I remember, so my dad is a physician, and growing up, I have distinct memories of these old medical books he would have around my house. And before I could even really read them, I would open them up and I'd thumb through them and I'd look at the pictures, and all of it seemed preposterous and fantastical. And I couldn't really intuit the meaning. I just understood that it was this source of knowledge, and it was referencing this world outside of my scope of knowledge and experience, and that intrigues me. And I think later on we'll get a chance to talk about some of my other books and projects that I've done. A lot of them are meditations on this theme of like what like sort of guides to or journals from or pieces of literature from alternative realms of thought or matter or reality, and in this case one that sort of feels like something that might exist in the Pokemon world without a lot of like without a lot of like obfuscating or like, you know, distance between you and the reader. You pick it up and you feel like you're holding something that plopped right out of Professor Oak's bookshelf.
I had a thought. Oh yeah. So with going back to what you were saying, I really like that as well because as you know, as we're walking around every day, you know, we're not looking at our muscles aren't visible and our skeletons aren't visible, and so as especially as a kid, you know, seeing that, you know, is really a foreign visual to see. That's not something you probably have ever seen or understood. You couldn't read, you said at the time. So that's very interesting to think about, going back to that sort of child mindset of this thing that is very real, but to you it's very fantastical and fictional and foreign. Moving on though, oh, you've also done characters like Samus Aran. We talked about Diva from Overwatch. You've also done Pharah and Zenyatta from Overwatch. You've done Darth Vader, Master Chief, Iron Man. So what's like the contrast between looking at the deconstruction of biology and robotics?
It's an excellent question. We touched on it just a little bit earlier, where like with biology, you need, I think, a little bit more of a scientific understanding if you want to present it in a way that feels compelling. You know, it's a lot of like squishy, interlocking, overlaid systems. And with something that's more mechanical, it really becomes more of an artistic exercise because, you know, of course, Iron Man's suit, the things that it can do, there's no existing mechanical system in the world that can create that. There is something in the world that exists that I can reference for like Pikachu's biology. But, you know, with, you know, Diva's suit, you are attempting to convey the idea of like a big hydraulic leg, and there's nothing that you can refer back to. So it becomes less of a scientific exercise and more of an artistic one. And growing up, it was like I've kind of a smeary, smooth digital style, and it makes it very easy to draw like soft, squishy, flowy things. And it's very challenging for me to draw mechanical structures, gears, cogs, straight lines. They just don't lend themselves to my particular style and disposition. And so it started as a way of like challenging myself and like delving more deeply into the artistic side and less the scientific side of this like this weird thing that I do.
No, that makes sense actually, because these things don't exist, so it kind of is with no real way to base it. It's just imagination. How do you think it work in your imagination? As well as going back to your style, like machines are they're factory assembled, I guess is what I'd say. So they are perfect, they're angular, they're cold, they're metal, and it varies different from human flesh. Yeah. So why do you like to look at these fantastical and fictional characters as opposed to real animals, people, and plants? And I think we might have already touched on that a little bit earlier too, right?
I don't know if I think I like them both. Ultimately,
you like them both?
Like it's I always enjoy learning more about the world, about biology, about living organisms. And so it's this seamless continuum in my mind, with like what I enjoy doing. I enjoy being able to like imagine the impossibility of these creatures, sort of bring them from their own world into a space that feels plausible. And at the same time, I do also love like looking at things that do exist and admiring the sort of incredible implausibility of some of their, you know, behaviors, abilities. You know, it's like a gradient from, you know, the impossible to the totally mundane, and sort of blurring that gap wherever possible, and making the real world a little more fantastic, and making these fantastical worlds a little more real. If that makes sense.
No, that makes sense. It's bridging fiction to reality in their own respective worlds into just one. More or less. Am I comparing that right, would you say?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So you wanted to talk about your other books. So tell us about your other books. The Feminomicon. I always can't pronounce the Necronomicon from. So if I'm pronouncing this one wrong too, I'm sorry. And a natural history of the fantastic, as well as the store Metaverse books. Want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the store Multiverse Books.
Oh yes, sorry.
It's so that's like my online Etsy storefront and my own book printing company. I noticed recently all my books have very difficult titles to say. A little bit of a word jumble. Pokenatomy, Feminomicon, Natural History of the Fantastic. The Feminomicon is the one that I did before Pokenatomy, and that was it's a take on like the Necronomicon, the famous Lovecraftian tome. And in this case, it's like a sort of like an illustrated encyclopedia or even like a monster manual, a bestiary of mythical women from all around the world. So like goddesses, demon monsters, some are good, some are bad, some are really scary, but they're all based in actual human folklore from Japan, China, Native America, the Middle East, medieval Europe, Africa, Australia. And I did that one just because like I also have a love of mythology and human folklore, and I wanted to sort of, and after doing some research for my book, A Natural History of the Fantastic, which was the first book I did, I wanted to, I found all these like incredible, sort of working backwards chronologically, but I found all these incredible creatures while I was researching that book, most of which were unacknowledged or unknown. Things like the Futakuchiona, which is this, the Japanese woman with the mouth growing out the back of her head. That really interested me, and I wanted the chance to draw all these incredible creatures in sort of a horror style and collect them and to shine some light on this sort of forgotten, neglected, and long distant part of human mythology.
So going back to Pokemon in this actually fast, are you familiar with a Generation 3 Pokemon named Mawile?
Absolutely. That's based on the Futakuchiona.
That's what I was thinking. Okay, yes. So nice little connection there too.
Yeah, it all ties together.
Did you want to?
Jinx too is also based on an old Japanese folk legend of like this sort of mountain dwelling.
Raiju? Not Raiju. No.
I actually don't remember exactly what it's called, so I feel foolish for bringing it up. But they're like, yeah, a lot of that it has its roots in like the mythology of Japan and those figures.
Then maybe you want to talk about the A Natural History of the Fantastic bit more, maybe, or.
So that one was my first book that I ever did, and it was like my first weird labor of love and my first toe dipping into the idea that I might be able to do art for a living and combine it with my love of biology. That one is in some ways like a scientific guidebook to mythical creatures, and it's framed a lot more like a narrative. It's this doomed scientific journey through a strange Lovecraftian world, and it was very personal at the time because I saw it as reflecting my own attempts to bridge a love of the fantastical, of centaurs, dragons, trolls, mermaids, goblins, with my fixation on the scientific. And in the book, the narrator, like these pieces of letters and scripts from within the world, all are attempting to reconcile the impossibility of these creatures with like a desire to have a scientific worldview. And it's about, confronting this like superstitions and the supernatural, these fearful monsters, dragons and trolls, and discovering that these horrifying beasts that have terrified humankind, have like ignited nightmares, have like a place in the world and an underlying structure and a reason for being here too. And so it's kind of like Pokenatomy in some ways, but less scientific and more narrative, more about investigating the philosophy of like where the impossible realm of human myth and the plausible and practical worlds of human science interact.
Yeah. I'm sort of taking a wild guess here with this sort of comparison. But so the way I'm seeing this description is just like with Pokenatomy, you're taking the fact that Pikachu we can't just accept that Pikachu has the ability to create electricity. There has to be some function, some reason for it, in a way that maybe Pikachu fits into the ecosystem, etc. And you're trying to tie the same sort of connections with these monsters. Like, there's a reason why these, I've forgotten the name, but like the ice ladies in like Japanese mythology, they're like ice ghasts. Not Will-o'-the-Wisp though. That's different, I believe.
They're like, are you thinking of like Yukiona? They're
Yes,
like these
yes.
they're snow women.
Yes, snow women. Thank you. Like they have a place in the ecosystem as well as they have like reasons for being. They have reasons of why, not reasons, but I guess more maybe like biological functions as well. The narrator is trying to grasp that these things have, belonging in the world, I guess, right?
Yeah, specifically with A Natural History of the Fantastic, it's like, like how dragons might fly or produce fire, how imps or centaurs could function, how they could coexist in an ecosystem along humans, sort of like just attempting to look at something as preposterous as like a centaur and say like, all right, just for the purposes of like this book, this mindset, this entertainment value, let's take this at face value. How might it work? And like just have fun from there. And again, like the Phenomenomicon is not a scientific book. It's more like just a mythology text, but it still has that kind of deconstructive flair where we're investigating like, I think you learn something about human history, about human myth, and about human identity by looking at mythology, just as you do by looking at our scientific disciplines.
All right. Are there any closing thoughts that you have? Do you like anything else you'd like to say while you have this chance to on the podcast?
Oh boy. I'm not sure I have anything left to say. I think we've covered just about everything, except thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
All right. Yeah, I'm so glad to have you. This has been a really great opportunity and interview, and your work is really interesting and cool. So where can the fans see your work, buy your books, and follow your social media accounts?
All right, plug time. So you can follow me on Instagram at Topher Stoll, TOPHER STOLL. I also have an Etsy store that's Multiverse Books. If you type in Pokenatomy online, it's one of the first things that comes up. You can also find my work, follow my social media feeds through stallart.com. I do giveaways on Instagram. I've been trying to take social media a little more seriously and really promote stuff and put out my work so that people can see it. Because again, I've only been doing this for a couple of years, and for the first time in my life, it feels like there's an audience out there who wants to see this stuff, and it's a really exciting chance to interact with fans. So please, follow me on all that.
All right, cool. And once again, you can follow the Nintendo Power Zone as well here on YouTube for this video portion, or on Stitcher Radio, iTunes, Google Play. We upload bi-weekly now, as well as this new series, Super Nerds, where we feature fans who go above and beyond to show their love and
obsessions.
Yeah, obsessions with Nintendo and these characters and these worlds. So please follow us. Episodes bi-weekly. Like I said, you can follow me on Twitter at the King Blooz, Blooz spelled BLOOZ, and at the Power Zone, Power Zone on Twitter as well. But thank you guys so much for listening, and this has been a great interview.
Thank you so much.